World War II, a conflict that defined an entire century. Its battles, its leaders, they're the stuff of legend. But what if I told you the official history isn't the whole truth? That it's a carefully constructed narrative, leaving the most incredible, the most unbelievable stories buried in darkness?
The story we've all been told is one of grand strategy and iconic moments. A simple story of clear heroes and villains. But it's a story with entire chapters deliberately torn out. Truths that were deemed too strange or perhaps too sensitive for the public record.
Think about this for a moment. The accepted narrative, the story you know. It might only represent about 10% of what truly happened. The rest of it, the vast majority, lies submerged, a reality far, far stranger than we were ever led to believe.
So you have to ask, what's in that other 90%? What classified operations and radical technologies have been scrubbed from the history books? And what truths were considered too dangerous to ever see the light of day?
We know the familiar images of the war. They're etched into our collective memory. Giant columns of tanks churning through the mud, squadrons of fighters dueling in the skies, a massive global conflict defined by industrial power and the sheer force of arms.
These are the official milestones, right? The invasion of Poland in '39, the infamous attack on Pearl Harbor, the brutal, city-shattering turning point at Stalingrad, the massive Normandy landings on D-Day, and finally the fall of Berlin. This is the war as it was recorded for history. But that's not the whole story. Not even close. Declassified archives now prove that behind this public war, another secret conflict was raging. A war fought not with conventional armies, but with radical, almost unbelievable ideas. A shadow war of clandestine projects so outlandish, they defy belief.
And let's be perfectly clear. These weren't the fantasies of some science fiction writer. They were real, government-funded projects, backed by millions of dollars and developed by some of the most brilliant minds of the era. What you are about to see is not speculation. It is documented fact.
So now, we open the files. We're diving into the shadow projects. These are the secret weapons they never told you about. Concepts so audacious that, had they actually been deployed, they might have completely rewritten the outcome of the war.
First up, imagine a weapon born from the very ocean it was designed to conquer. In the absolutely desperate Battle of the Atlantic, Allied planners came up with something that sounds truly impossible. An unsinkable warship literally forged from ice.
It was codenamed Project Habakkuk. The goal? To build a fleet of enormous aircraft carriers out of something called pipecrete, a revolutionary and incredibly strong compound made of ice mixed with wood pulp. Each one of these ships would have been 2,000 feet long, a floating, indestructible fortress in the middle of the Atlantic, launching planes to hunt German U-boats. It sounds crazy, but a working prototype was actually built before the sheer logistics of it all shelved the plan for good.
But bizarre weaponry wasn't just a British idea. Over in the United States, military scientists were developing a biological weapon of a completely different sort. One that would turn one of nature's most harmless creatures into a swarm of tiny, flying firebombs.
They called it Project X-Ray. The concept was as simple as it was terrifying. Attach tiny incendiary bombs to millions of bats, cool them down so they'd hibernate, and then drop them in canisters over Japanese cities. As they warmed up and woke up, the bats would naturally fly into the eaves of thousands of wooden buildings to find shelter. Then, timers would detonate the bombs, sparking countless small fires all at once, creating a firestorm that would be almost impossible to contain. Meanwhile, deep inside the Third Reich, German engineers were in a frantic race to develop so-called Wunderwaffen, or wonder weapons. And among the most secret of these were radical new aircraft designs. So far ahead of their time, they looked like they came from another world entirely.
We now know from declassified German archives that there were confirmed designs for advanced circular wing or disc-shaped aircraft. Now, they never saw combat, but the blueprints and the prototype reports prove these projects were absolutely real. In fact, they were so unconventional that after the war, captured documents and eyewitness accounts would go on to ignite the entire modern UFO phenomenon.
So you have to ask yourself, an aircraft carrier made of ice, firebombing bats, flying desks. If these incredible projects were real, why are they just footnotes in our history books, if they're mentioned at all? Why was this part of the war so deliberately buried? Well, the answers really come down to a policy of deliberate secrecy. For one, the documents related to these projects were sealed for over 50 years under national security classifications. For another, these stories are often just inconvenient. They complicate the clean, heroic narrative of the war that we've all been told. And finally, some truths are simply so strange, so incredible, that they defy any easy explanation.
But this hidden history is about more than just a collection of bizarre technologies. You know, it's a story about human ingenuity under the most extreme pressure imaginable. It's about the ordinary people, the scientists and engineers who are tasked with turning the impossible into a reality, pushing the very boundaries of what anyone thought was achievable.
The official history is not the complete history. It is just a single layer of a much deeper, more complex story. A story that was hidden away for decades, deep in the shadows of the greatest war the world has ever known. This is the history they never wanted you to see.
In the final, desperate days of the Second World War, as Allied armies closed in on the heart of the Reich, they began to uncover secrets. Secrets that were buried deep in underground labs and hidden away in heavily guarded research facilities. What they found were projects so advanced, so far beyond the known science of the era, they seemed to defy all logic. This is the story of the Wunderwaffen, the so-called wonder weapons of Nazi Germany. What you were never told in the history books is that Nazi Germany was on the very edge of creating technology that sounds like it was ripped straight from science fiction. But this isn't fiction. The evidence was left behind, buried in declassified files, and the chilling eyewitness reports from intelligence officers who saw it with their own eyes. Just think about this for a second. Flying saucers. Sound cannons that could literally kill a man with a single blast of focused sound. A giant mirror in orbit designed to incinerate entire cities from space. Anti-gravity devices. And stealth aircraft that were a full 50 years ahead of their time. And let's be clear, these were not just conspiracy theories. They were active, high-priority projects, all documented in the secret archives of a dying empire. We have to start with the most enigmatic project of them all, a device known only by its cryptic codename, Die Glocke, or the Bell. Our story begins in the chaos of 1945, in a classified underground complex buried deep in what is now Poland, and what was found there has fueled speculation for decades. Allied intelligence officers stumbled upon a colossal bell-shaped object. Picture it, 9 feet tall, 12 feet wide, and forged from an exceptionally hard, heavy metal that no one could identify. It was housed inside a bizarre concrete structure later nicknamed the Henge, which seemed to have been built for the sole purpose of testing this one mysterious device. The few reports that survived from that time describe its inner workings. Inside the spell were 2 massive cylinders engineered to spin in opposite directions at incredible speeds. And they were filled with a strange, violet-colored metallic liquid, a substance the Germans codenamed Serum 525. When this thing was activated, it was said to emit a powerful and deadly radiation field. Which brings us to the central question. What on earth was this machine for? The entire project was classified at the highest possible level, its secrets guarded with lethal force by the SS. But the theories that have been pieced together from fragments of intelligence, well, they paint a terrifying picture of its potential. Some researchers believe it was an experimental anti-gravity propulsion system, an attempt to literally manipulate gravity itself, maybe for a new generation of super aircraft. Others are convinced it was a weapon of almost unimaginable power. And then there's the most extreme theory, that it was something else entirely, a primitive machine for bending space and time. And then it was just gone. As the war came to a close, the Bell, its lead scientist, SS General Hans Kammler, and his entire research team simply disappeared. They vanished without a trace, taking the secrets of Die Glocke with them, and leaving behind only a concrete ruin and a mystery that endures to this day. So now we move from the speculative to the terrifyingly real, because while the Bell remains a mystery, other weapons were actually captured intact. These were prototypes of aircraft and artillery so advanced, they forced Allied engineers to completely rethink the very future of warfare. Just take a look at this. On the left, you see a German aircraft from 1944, and on the right, an American stealth bomber from the 1990s. That resemblance? It is not a coincidence. The Horton Ho 229 was the world's first true stealth aircraft. It was a jet-powered flying wing built from a special plywood infused with carbon dust designed specifically to absorb radar waves. To Allied radar at the time, it was almost completely invisible. When American forces finally captured the prototype, their engineers were absolutely stunned. Post-war analysis concluded the Ho-229 would have been practically undetectable by Britain's radar network. As one Allied engineer put it, if these planes had reached mass production just 6 months sooner, the outcome of the air war could have been drastically different. Now, you've probably heard of the V-1 and V-2 rockets, but their successor was arguably even more terrifying. The V-3, or Vengeance Weapon 3, wasn't a rocket at all. It was a gun, a supergun. Its barrel stretched 500 feet long, built directly into a hillside in occupied France and aimed right at the heart of London. The design was as simple as it was diabolical. A series of charges would fire in sequence down that massive barrel, rocketing a shell to speeds of over a mile per second. The plan was to build 25 of these gun tubes, creating a non-stop artillery storm, raining down 150 high-explosive shells on London every single hour. And this weapon was not just a blueprint. While Allied earthquake bombs managed to destroy the main facility before it was fully operational, a smaller, prototype version of the V-3 was actually deployed. In the final months of the war, it fired 183 shells into the city of Luxembourg, proving the chilling effectiveness of the design. The Nazis had simply run out of time. From the real, we now step into what feels like pure science fiction. Captured documents have revealed that Nazi scientists weren't just trying to improve existing technology. They were attempting to weaponize the very laws of physics itself, designing acoustic and even orbital weapons that truly belonged in a different century. They were developing two main types of acoustic weapons. The first was the sound cannon. It used focused sound waves from methane explosions, and at close range, it could vibrate a person's internal organs to the point of death. The second was the whirlwind cannon, a device designed to generate artificial tornadoes, powerful enough to literally shear the wings off Allied bombers in mid-flight. But the most audacious concept of all was a project known as the Sonnengewehr, the sun gun. This was a plan for the ultimate superweapon, one that would give the Reich control not just of the earth, but of the heavens above. The plan, which was detailed by captured scientists after the war, was to build a massive mirror in orbit, over a mile wide. This mirror would collect and focus the sun's rays into a single, intensely hot beam, a beam capable of boiling oceans and burning entire cities to ashes from space. Now, the project was decades from being possible, but the fact that teams of scientists were actively working on the math tells you everything you need to know about the regime's limitless ambition and its madness. The war finally ended, and these revolutionary, horrifying weapons programs were shut down. But what happened to the brilliant yet morally compromised minds that created them? The answer is perhaps the most unsettling part of this entire story. You see, they didn't face justice. They got job offers. Through a top-secret program, codenamed Operation Paperclip, the United States government quietly brought over 1,600 German scientists and engineers to America. These were the very men who designed the V-2 rockets, the stealth jets, and the superguns. Their knowledge, it was decided, was simply too valuable to leave behind. And the most famous of these men was Wernher von Braun. In 1945, he was the head of the V-2 rocket program, a weapon built by slave laborers from concentration camps. Just over 2 decades later, in 1969, he was an American hero, the chief architect of the Saturn V rocket that fulfilled humanity's oldest dream and put a man on the moon. The chilling truth is that the very foundations of the Cold War space race and so much of our modern aerospace technology were built upon the research of the Third Reich. The line separating their weapons programs from our own technological progress is uncomfortably and undeniably short. This hidden history raises profound questions about science, about morality, and about what it really means to win a war. But the story doesn't end here. Declassified files show the Nazis weren't the only ones with secret labs and bizarre projects. So, what were the Allies hiding? What secret weapons were they developing in the desperate race for victory? Well, the truth is just as strange. When we think of the Second World War, certain images come to mind: the Spitfire, the Sherman tank, the aircraft carrier. These were the iconic tools that shaped the battlefields we know from history books. But that's not the whole story. Beneath this official history lies another war, a secret war, fought with weapons of breathtaking and sometimes bizarre ingenuity. Tonight, we open the declassified files on the secret weapons, the strange plots, and the desperate gambles they never wanted you to know about. That isn't hyperbole. It's a stark conclusion drawn from files that were classified for decades. You see, the story of World War II that you think you know, it's only half the picture. The other half was fought in the shadows with weapons born from sheer desperation. And that's where the truth is often far, far stranger than fiction. These were not fantasies. Every single concept you see here was an officially funded project, seriously researched by military planners. They represent a hidden chapter of the war, a chapter where victory didn't just depend on bullets and bombs, but on pure, unconventional audacity. Our first declassified file reveals a plan to win a battle not with force, but with illusion. This is the story of an army that wasn't even there. So how do you fool one of the most powerful military machines in history? You don't try to outgun them, you outthink them. For one top-secret Allied unit, the answer was to create an entire army out of thin air, an elaborate phantom force designed to deceive the Third Reich when it mattered most. Their official designation was the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, but they were unlike any other unit in the war. They weren't soldiers in the traditional sense. No, they were artists, actors, sound engineers, and architects. Their battlefield wasn't land, it was the enemy's mind. And their weapon was deception. Declassified reports revealed just how stunningly successful they were. In one critical operation, German intelligence reported a massive buildup, 2 armored divisions, some 30,000 troops, getting ready to attack. But the declassified reality? It was just a little over 1,000 men, armed with inflatable props and powerful sound trucks, expertly creating the illusion of an overwhelming force. Their arsenal was a masterpiece of military theater. They had inflatable Sherman tanks that weighed only 90 pounds, so light a few men could carry them, but completely real from the air. They had powerful speakers that could broadcast the sounds of an entire division on the move, sounds that were audible from 15 miles away. And to complete the illusion, actors, dressed as GIs, would go into local French towns to spread carefully crafted misinformation in cafes, knowing full well that German spies were listening. This ghost army conducted over 20 major deception operations. Their masterpiece was Operation Viersen, where they successfully drew German forces away from the real crossing point of the Rhine River, the final major obstacle into Germany. This one act of deception is credited with saving thousands of Allied lives. And yet their heroism was completely shrouded in secrecy. The entire operation remained classified until 1996, a full 50 years after the war was over. The Ghost Army proved that unconventional thinking could save lives. But other top-secret programs took that same kind of thinking to a much, much stranger place. Allied planners began looking for a military advantage in a truly unexpected source, the animal kingdom. What they came up with was a plan to turn some of nature's most unassuming creatures into instruments of total war. In the Pacific, Allied strategists were facing a unique challenge. You see, the very structure of Japanese cities, with buildings made of wood, bamboo, and paper, made them incredibly vulnerable to fire. A single spark could quickly become a city-wide inferno. So the strategic question was a daunting one. Conventional bombs were just too imprecise. What they needed was a way to start thousands of small fires, all at once across a vast urban area, something that would simply overwhelm any firefighting response. The declassified solution they came up with was biologically brilliant and utterly terrifying. Declassified files call it Project X-ray. Today, it's better known as the Bat Bomb. And the logic behind it was grimly effective. Bats naturally seek out dark enclosed spaces to roost. So the plan was to release millions of bats over a city at dawn, each carrying a tiny, timed incendiary device. They would find shelter in the eaves and attics of thousands of wooden buildings across the city. And then, the timers would detonate, igniting the entire city from within. Now, this wasn't just some crazy idea. The project got presidential approval and $2 million in funding. A test even proved the concept was terrifyingly effective when a few armed bats accidentally escaped and burned down an entire aircraft hangar and a general's car. Project X-ray was only canceled because another, even more powerful secret weapon was almost ready: the atomic bomb. The British, of course, had their own macabre innovations. The Special Operations Executive developed what they called the exploding rat. The plan was simple: fill rat carcasses with plastic explosives and leave them near factory furnaces. A worker, finding the dead rat, would almost certainly dispose of it in the fire, triggering a massive explosion. The Germans actually discovered a shipment of these rats, but the discovery itself became a psychological weapon. It caused such paranoia that they wasted huge amounts of time and manpower hunting for booby-trapped rats that, by then, weren't even being used anymore. In the frozen waters of the North Atlantic, another secret war was raging. German U-boats were strangling the Allied supply lines to Britain, and the Allies were running out of steel to build the ships they needed to fight back. It was a desperate situation that called for a truly radical solution: a warship made entirely of ice. The Battle of the Atlantic was a war of attrition. The Allies desperately needed air cover to protect their convoys, but aircraft carriers required immense quantities of steel, a resource that was becoming critically scarce. That's when an inventor named Geoffrey Pike came forward with a proposal for a new material, one that was abundant, cheap, and, he claimed, even stronger than concrete. He called it picrete. It was a simple mixture of wood pulp and water, frozen together. But this frozen composite had astonishing properties. It had the tensile strength of concrete, it was nearly impossible to shatter, and it melted at an incredibly slow rate. This, he argued, was the material from which a new class of warship could be built. The project was codenamed Habakkuk, and it quickly gained support at the highest levels of command. To prove picrate's unbelievable durability to a group of skeptical admirals, Lord Mountbatten famously pulled out his service pistol and fired at a block of it. As the story goes, the bullet ricocheted right off, narrowly missing an admiral, but making its point with dramatic flair. The proposed ship was a true behemoth, a floating fortress of ice. At 2,000 feet long, it would have been more than twice the length of the Titanic. Its hull would be 40 feet thick, making it impervious to torpedoes. A large-scale prototype was actually built in Canada, and it proved the concept worked. But as the war dragged on, better anti-submarine tactics and the sheer logistical challenges of building such a vessel meant that Project Habakkuk was ultimately scuttled. Our final declassified file reveals what is perhaps the most bizarre plot of the entire war. This was a plan that didn't target Hitler's armies, or even his life. It targeted his very identity. It was a secret war of chemistry, aimed directly at the Führer himself. Hidden deep within British intelligence archives is a proposal of startling audacity. It was a plan to secretly introduce female estrogen hormones into Adolf Hitler's food. The goal wasn't to kill him, it was to fundamentally change his personality. The logic was cold and calculated. Poison simply wasn't an option. Hitler employed food tasters who would detect any known toxin. Estrogen, on the other hand, was tasteless, odorless, and its effects would be gradual and subtle. British intelligence believed it could make him more docile, less aggressive, subduing his megalomania from the inside out. The declassified proposal was meticulously planned. Step 1, get the tasteless hormones. Step 2, find and bribe a source with direct access to Hitler's food. Step 3, secretly introduce the substance into his daily meals. And Step 4, simply wait for the psychological transformation to take hold, hoping it would curb his aggression and soften his temper. Now, whether the plan was ever actually attempted is still a matter of historical debate, but the fact that it exists at all in the official record is a testament to the psychological dimension of total war. It reveals that in the fight against absolute tyranny, no idea, no matter how strange, was truly off the table. The Ghost Army, the Bat Bomb, the Ice Carrier, the Hormone Plot. These declassified projects reveal a hidden layer of the Second World War. They prove that the history we read in textbooks is never the full story. And it forces us to ask a chilling question. What other secrets remain buried in the archives, just waiting to be declassified?
In the vast saga of the Second World War, there are names that resonate with power. Names etched into our collective memory, taught in our schools, and immortalized on film. Stalingrad, the brutal, bloody turning point on the Eastern Front. D-Day, the single greatest invasion force ever assembled. Midway, the naval battle that sealed the fate of the Pacific. We know these stories. They were, without a doubt, the epicenters of the global conflict.
But what if that well-known history is incomplete? What if the war wasn't just fought over there in the fields of Europe or the islands of the Pacific? What they never told you in the history books is that the war came to America. And I mean that literally. Enemy soldiers on American soil.
And what about a different kind of war? A war fought not just against men, but against nature itself. A brutal, frozen conflict waged in the crushing darkness of the Arctic, where the cold killed more soldiers than any bullet could.
These are the stories that have been lost to time. We're about to open the forgotten files of World War II, to journey to the frozen fronts, the campaigns that, while erased from the popular story, were absolutely pivotal to the final Allied victory.
Okay, so our first declassified story takes us to the months right after the shock of Pearl Harbor. The war had finally come home to America, but not in the way anyone, and I mean anyone, expected.
It's June 1942. Imperial Japanese forces invade and occupy two islands, Attu and Kiska. Now, this is the shocking part. These weren't distant Pacific islands. They were part of Alaska. For the first time since the War of 1812, a foreign enemy had captured and occupied sovereign American territory. This was the hidden invasion, a secret front line just a stone's throw from the mainland.
So, why would they do this? Well, strategic documents lay out a three-part strategy. First, they wanted to set up a defensive perimeter way up in the North Pacific. Second, and this was clever, they hoped to divert American ships and attention away from the huge battle that was about to happen at Midway. And third, and this is the really chilling part, they saw it as a potential stepping stone for an attack on mainland Alaska.
You'd think the U.S. would respond immediately, right? Wrong. For almost a full year, the Japanese flag flew over American soil. It took until May of 1943 for U.S. forces to finally launch a counterattack on the island of Attu. And what they walked into? It was a special kind of hell.
You see, the biggest enemy on Attu wasn't the Japanese soldier. It was the island itself. Imagine this: frozen tundra as far as the eye can see, a thick, constant fog that cuts visibility to near zero, and a relentless, damp cold that gets right into your bones. It was a nightmare. In fact, official combat reports actually show that more American GIs were taken out of the fight by frostbite and exposure than by Japanese bullets. And the fighting? It was absolutely savage. When the Japanese defenders knew they were beaten, they launched one of the biggest, most desperate banzai charges of the entire Pacific War. The aftermath? It's just staggering to comprehend. Out of about 2,500 Japanese soldiers on that island, only 28 were taken alive. The rest were killed or took their own lives. And for the Americans, over 2,000 casualties. For the number of men involved, that makes Attu one of the deadliest battles in the entire Pacific campaign.
All right, so while American soldiers were battling fog and frostbite in Alaska, a whole other hidden war was raging halfway across the world, in the freezing, dark waters of the Arctic Ocean. This wasn't just a battle of men and machines. It was a battle of sheer human endurance against the worst nature could throw at them.
They called it the Murmansk Run, and from 1941 all the way to 45, huge convoys of Allied ships sailed this unbelievably dangerous route. Their mission? To get millions of tons of war supplies, tanks, planes, fuel, to their ally, the Soviet Union. But to do it, they had to run a gauntlet of German U-boats, bombers from the Luftwaffe, and the constant threat of massive Nazi warships lurking in the fjords of Norway.
And to understand just how horrific this journey was, you only need to hear the story of one convoy. Its code name was PQ-17. In the summer of 1942, 35 cargo ships set out. Think about that. 35 ships filled with vital supplies. Only 11 of them ever reached a friendly port.
So what went so horribly wrong? Well, British intelligence got word that the massive German battleship the Tirpitz might be sailing out to attack. Panic set in. The Admiralty in London issued a single, fatal order. Convoy is to scatter. Just like that, their protective warships turned back, and the convoy was dissolved. The slow, unarmed merchant ships were now all alone, spread out across the Arctic Sea. For the German U-boats and bombers, it was a turkey shoot. They just picked them off, one by one by one.
The final tally was just unbelievable. 24 ships sunk, thousands of tanks, hundreds of planes, and tons of other supplies, all at the bottom of the ocean. It was such a disaster that it led Winston Churchill himself to give the route its famous nickname, the worst journey in the world. But here's the thing, that incredible sacrifice wasn't for nothing. Far from it. The strategic value of this route was immense. Get this, even with all the losses, this one sea lane was responsible for delivering about one quarter of all the aid the Western Allies sent to the Soviet Union during the entire war. And that aid, we're talking American tanks, British fighter planes, it arrived at the most desperate moments of the war. It was absolutely crucial in helping the Red Army stop the Nazis at the gates of Moscow and later to turn the entire tide of the war at Stalingrad. It is not an exaggeration to say that without those sailors and their worst journey in the world, the Eastern Front might have completely collapsed. The outcome of the war could have been terrifyingly different.
And the most tragic part of this story. For the men who actually survived this frozen hell, their bravery was met with silence. For decades, they received no official recognition, no medal. It wasn't until 2012, think about that, nearly 70 years later, that the British government finally created a specific medal for the Arctic convoy veterans. Of course, by then, most of them were already gone.
So the invasion of Alaska and the Arctic convoys, these are just two chapters from the hidden history of World War II. Two stories that were almost completely erased. And it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? It forces us to ask that critical question, what else don't we know? What other stories of incredible sacrifice and forgotten heroism are still buried, just waiting in the archives to be discovered?
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going way off the beaten path. We're journeying far beyond the battlefields you know to uncover the vast, often forgotten fronts of the Second World War. These are places where the fight was just as desperate, but whose stories are rarely told. You know, when you think of World War II, your mind probably jumps to D-Day, Stalingrad, maybe Pearl Harbor. But the conflict was truly global, fought in places like tropical islands, frozen cities, and impossibly dense jungles. Our common understanding? It's often incomplete. And today, we're going to change that. All right, our first stop is the massive island of Madagascar, way off the coast of Africa. Back in 1942, it was the site of a preemptive strike that honestly seemed to make no sense at all at the time. I mean, think about it. Weren't Britain and France supposed to be allies? So why on earth would British forces be invading a French colonial territory right in the middle of a war against Germany? Well, the answer is tangled up in the complicated politics of a defeated nation. See, after France fell in 1940, the country was basically split, and the government that controlled Madagascar was known as Vichy France. While they were officially neutral, they often cooperated with the Axis powers, which created this really dangerous, ambiguous situation for the Allies. And you can really see the dominoes falling here. Japan's victories in early 1942 were just stunning, and it put them right on the doorstep of the Indian Ocean. The British were terrified that Japan would pressure the Vichy French into letting them use Madagascar's ports. And if that happened, Japanese submarines could sever critical Allied supply lines to India and the Middle East. That was a risk the Allies just couldn't take. So Britain launched Operation Ironclad, but this was no walk in the park. Madagascar is huge. I mean, it's bigger than France itself. And the fight wasn't just against the Vichy forces. The absolutely brutal terrain and tropical diseases like malaria turned out to be even deadlier enemies for the Allied troops. And here's the kicker, the thing that proves the British weren't just being paranoid. While the battle was still going on, a Japanese submarine did the unthinkable. It snuck into the main harbor and actually torpedoed a British battleship. This was one of Japan's furthest naval operations of the entire war, and it proved the strategic threat was absolutely real. Now, we're going to do a complete 180. We're going from a tropical island to a frozen city on the Eastern Front, to a battle forgotten not because of how remote it was, but because of its almost incomprehensible horror. We're going to Leningrad. 872 days. Just let that sink in for a second. From September 1941 to January 1944. That's nearly 2.5 years. The city of Leningrad was completely surrounded by German and Finnish forces, with 3 million civilians trapped inside. And make no mistake, the goal here wasn't conquest, it was annihilation. Hitler's orders were crystal clear. The city was to be starved into submission and then literally wiped off the face of the earth. This chilling policy led directly to one of the deadliest sieges in all of human history. And that policy led to a level of desperation that's hard to even imagine. The daily bread ration dropped to just 125 grams. A few thin slices, often bulked up with sawdust and wallpaper paste. People ate anything to survive. Pets, rats, they boiled leather belts. The city's only lifeline was a dangerous truck route across a frozen lake, all while under constant enemy fire. By the time the siege was finally broken, the human cost was just staggering. It's estimated that 1 million civilians died. The vast majority didn't die from bombs or bullets, but from simple starvation. Bodies piled up in the streets because the living were just too weak to bury them. To really put this in perspective, in the West, we often hear about the London Blitz. It was a terrible ordeal that killed about 43,000 civilians. But the siege of Leningrad, it claimed over 20 times that number. It's a scale of suffering that's almost impossible to wrap your head around.
Okay, let's leave the freezing cold behind, because our journey now takes us somewhere completely different, into the suffocating, sweltering jungles of Southeast Asia. This is the Burma Campaign, a conflict so overlooked that the guys who actually fought there bitterly called it the Forgotten War.
See, in this part of the world, soldiers weren't just fighting the Japanese Imperial Army. They were fighting a second, equally relentless enemy, the jungle itself. Malaria, dysentery, the crushing humidity, monsoon rains, these things often prove to be even deadlier than enemy bullets. Things really came to a head here in 1944. The Japanese launched this massive offensive they called the March on Delhi, with the goal of invading British India. And the key to the whole thing was a small town called Kohima, where a tiny garrison of Allied soldiers had to make a desperate last stand against just overwhelming odds. And this is where the story gets just unbelievable. The fighting at Kohima was so intense, so close quarters, that the front line, the literal space between the opposing trenches, was the width of the district commissioner's tennis court. I'm not kidding. Soldiers were throwing grenades back and forth over the night. But that Allied garrison held on. Because they did, the entire Japanese offensive just collapsed, and the retreat that followed was a catastrophe. Over 50,000 Japanese soldiers died, many not even from the fighting, but from starvation and disease trying to get back through that same jungle. It was one of Japan's greatest land defeats of the entire war. So we've been to a tropical island, a starving city, and a deadly jungle. What's the big takeaway here? Why does remembering these forgotten fronts actually matter to how we understand the war? Well, each one of these fronts reveals the true, sprawling nature of the war. Madagascar, it shows the global chess match being played across oceans. Leningrad demonstrates the almost unimaginable human cost of total war. And Burma, it highlights the brutal struggle against nature itself. Each one is a vital piece of the puzzle. Look, this isn't just about adding new names to the map. It forces us to see World War II not as one single monolithic event, but as a collection of unique, brutal wars, all fought for different reasons, in completely different environments, and with vastly different human costs. It expands our entire understanding of what that global struggle really was. But the visible battlefield is only half the story. Wars aren't just won with guns and tanks. Sometimes they're won with secrets. And that gets you thinking, who were the real spies of World War II? Well, that's a story for our next explainer, where we'll meet the secret agents that Hollywood never told you about.
For 80 years, we've been told one version of the Second World War, a story of heroes and villains, of epic battles and world-changing decisions. But what if that story is incomplete? What if the most incredible chapters were deliberately left out, buried in classified files, and hidden from history?
It's time to discover the war they never told you about, the spies who are more audacious than any fiction, the weapons that seem to come from a dark future, and the mysteries that, even now, remain unsolved. This is the history that was hidden in the shadows. You know, when we picture a World War II spy, we think of Hollywood movies. But the reality? The reality was far stranger and infinitely more daring. The most effective agents weren't suave assassins. They were ordinary people who became masters of deception, and they changed the course of the war from the shadows.
In the archives, you find something that just shouldn't be possible. One man, Juan Pujol Garcia, received high military honors from both Nazi Germany and Great Britain during the very same war. He was a Spanish chicken farmer who hated fascism so much, he decided to become a British spy. When Britain rejected him, he just went to the Germans and invented an entire spy network out of thin air.
And the thing is, the Germans believed every single word he fed them. His fake intelligence was so convincing, so detailed, that British intelligence, the same people who turned him away, had to track him down and hire him as a double agent. His codename was Garbo, and he became the architect of the single greatest deception of the entire war.
It all came to a head on D-Day. As Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, Pujol was busy convincing the German High Command that it was all just a diversion. The real invasion, he insisted, was coming later at the Pas de Calais, and Hitler believed him.
2 entire panzer divisions sat and waited for an invasion that never came, all while the Allies secured their foothold in France. One man's phantom army saved thousands of real lives.
While Pujol fought his war with lies, others fought with a courage that is almost beyond belief. In occupied France, the Gestapo's most wanted target wasn't a soldier or a general. It was an American woman with a wooden leg. Her name was Virginia Hall, and she was one of the most dangerous Allied spies, building resistance networks right under the nose of the infamous Butcher of Lyon, Klaus Barbie himself.
Her determination was just legendary. At one point, fleeing the Gestapo, Hall had to cross the frozen Pyrenees Mountains into Spain, on foot. She radioed her handlers in London that her prosthetic leg, which she'd nicknamed Cuthbert, was giving her some trouble. Her superiors, having no idea Cuthbert was a part of her body, sent back that incredible reply. She made the crossing anyway, returned to France, and got right back to work.
But the secrets of this war weren't just carried by people, they were forged in steel and fire. The war was a laboratory for destruction, creating technologies so advanced they felt like they belonged to a different century. These were weapons that would reshape not just the battlefield, but the very course of human history.
I want you to imagine this. A weapon strikes your city at over 3,000 miles per hour. That's faster than the speed of sound. There's no air raid siren, no warning at all. The very first thing you experience is the explosion. It's only afterward that you hear the sound of its approach. Well, for millions, this was the terrifying reality of the V2 rocket.
It was the world's first long-range ballistic missile, a Nazi vengeance weapon that literally touched the edge of space before falling on cities like London and Antwerp, and there was absolutely no defense against it. But what the history books often don't tell you is the dark secret behind this technological leap, the hidden cost that is almost too terrible to comprehend.
Because declassified documents reveal a horrifying truth. The V2 rocket actually killed more people during its construction than it did in combat. It was assembled in hellish underground factories by over 12,000 slave laborers, people from concentration camps who died from starvation, disease, and execution. It was a weapon built on suffering just to inflict more suffering.
Now, perhaps the strangest secret weapon of the war was also one of the quietest. Using their recent discovery of the jet stream, Japan launched thousands of what they called fugo bombs. These were basically paper balloons carrying incendiary devices. They would float for 3 days across the Pacific, silently descending onto the American mainland. They ended up landing in 17 different states.
The U.S. government was absolutely terrified, not so much of the small bombs, but of what they could carry. What if the next wave of balloons was filled with biological agents like anthrax? So to prevent a nationwide panic, and crucially, to deny Japan any feedback on their weapon's success, they ordered a total media blackout. Not a word was to be printed. The Japanese, hearing nothing of fires or explosions, just assumed the program was a total failure and abandoned it. Silence itself became a weapon of war.
You know, the war ended 80 years ago, but its shadows linger. You'd think we'd know everything by now. We don't. Despite decades of searching, some secrets were buried so deep they may never be found. Priceless treasures vanished, critical documents remain classified, and some of the biggest questions are still without answers.
Take the Amber Room. It's hard to even describe. A breathtaking chamber made from 6 tons of amber panels, all backed with gold leaf and mirrors. People called it the 8th wonder of the world. The Nazis looted it in 1941, put it on display in Germany, and then, in the final chaotic days of the war, they packed it into crates. And it simply disappeared.
Today, its estimated value is over $500 million. For decades, treasure hunters have chased ghosts, following every rumor that it was burned in a fire, that it sank on a ship, that it's hidden in some secret Nazi bunker. So far, no one has found a trace.
So the question remains, one of the greatest unsolved art mysteries in all of history. Was it destroyed in the fires of war? Or is it still out there somewhere, sitting in darkness, waiting to be rediscovered? We don't know.
But maybe the greatest mystery isn't what was lost, but what is still being deliberately hidden from us. Right now, major governments still hold millions of pages of World War II documents under lock and key. We're talking about files on the recruitment of Nazi scientists, details of covert intelligence operations, controversial wartime decisions, documents that won't be seen for another generation, a full century after the war. What truths are still considered too sensitive for us to know?
You see, the Second World War was never a simple story of good versus evil written in black and white.
It was a complex human drama, filled with astonishing courage, dark compromises, and questions that still haunt us today. The official history? Well, that's just the beginning of a story. The real story is still emerging from the shadows.